January 15, 1954, Kenosha, Wisconsin. The engineer from Milwaukee stood in the frozen parking lot at 3 in the morning watching the prototype burn. 6 months of work turning into black smoke against the Wisconsin stars. The fire department was still 10 minutes out, but it didn't matter. The aluminum block was already warping, the experimental suspension melting into modern art. George Romney would want answers in 4 hours. The engineer didn't have any. All he had was frostbite starting in his fingers and the certainty that American Motors Corporation was running out of chances. The fire wasn't sabotage. The investigation would prove that 3 weeks later. Just a fuel line that couldn't handle the cold, installed by a worker making 90 cents an hour less than his counterpart in Detroit. But standing there watching his future melt, the engineer understood something that would haunt AMC for the next 33 years. They were always going to be 3 steps behind and $2 short. Detroit had armies. Kenosha had believers. Sometimes faith wasn't enough. The Ambassador project started in 1927, back when Nash Motors still thought they could take on the world. Charles Nash himself had walked the factory floor, touching every car like a father checking on sleeping children. He'd built washing machines before automobiles, understood that Americans wanted reliability more than revolution. The first Ambassador rolled off the line looking like money itself, chrome and leather and promise. It sold for $1,200 when Ford was pushing Model A's for $400. Nash didn't care. He wasn't competing on price. He was competing on dreams. By 1954, the dream had frost on it. The merger between Nash and Hudson created American Motors, but mergers born from desperation rarely birth greatness. Romney took over as president, knowing he had 18 months to save the company, maybe 24 if they cut salaries. The board gave him permission to do whatever it took. What it took was gambling everything on compact cars while keeping the Ambassador alive as their flagship, like keeping your best suit clean while you're digging ditches. The engineer from Milwaukee wasn't supposed to be there that night. His shift had ended at 11. But the prototype was his baby, and he'd promised his wife he'd check the block heater one more time. 28 years old, 2 kids, mortgage on a house, 8 blocks from the plant. His father had built Nash refrigerators in the same factory before they switched to cars. His grandfather had been there when Charlie Nash bought the company from General Motors in 1916. 3 generations of belief that David could compete with Goliath if David worked hard enough. The temperature hit 15 below that night. In the morning paper, between news about Eisenhower and the hydrogen bomb, the weather would make page 6. 3 homeless men frozen in Chicago, power lines down in Milwaukee, and in one paragraph. Near the bottom, a small fire at the AMC plant, quickly controlled, no injuries. The paper wouldn't mention that the fire killed the most advanced engine design American Motors had ever attempted. Wouldn't mention the engineers standing in the snow, calculating how many years behind Detroit they'd just fallen. Romney arrived at 6:30, still dark, wearing the same overcoat he'd worn since his Mormon mission. He didn't say anything at first, just stood next to the engineer, looking at the destroyed prototype. The metal had cooled enough to show its new shape, twisted modern sculpture that had been precision engineering 8 hours earlier. Romney pulled out a notepad, wrote something, tore off the page, and handed it to the engineer. It said, "Build it again, better, faster, cheaper than they can." Then he walked inside to fire 16 middle managers who'd been hired by the previous president. The engineer kept that note in his wallet until Vietnam took his oldest son in 1969. After that, nothing seemed worth keeping. The Ambassador line survived the fire, survived the merger, survived Romney leaving for Michigan politics. But survival and success occupied different neighborhoods, and AMC could never afford to move. In Detroit, General Motors was spending more on ashtrays than AMC spent on engines. Ford had test tracks that covered more acres than Kenosha had factories. Chrysler could afford to fail 3 times before breakfast. AMC had to hit a home run every time or forfeit the game. March 8, 1962. Detroit Auto Show. The sales manager from Racine stood between the new Chevrolet Impala and the AMC Ambassador, watching people flow like water, finding the easiest path. They'd circle the Ambassador, nod politely, then drift to the Chevrolet like iron filings to a magnet. He'd been watching this pattern for 3 hours. Counting. In 3 hours, 47 people had sat in the Impala. 8 had tried the Ambassador. 3 of those were AMC employees' families, there for support. The Ambassador was a good car. Hell, it was a great car. The build quality exceeded anything from the Big Three. The engine would run for 300,000 miles if you changed the oil. The suspension had been designed by the same engineer who'd watched his prototype burn 8 years earlier, rebuilt from memory and improved through anger. But none of that mattered. The Impala had Dinah Shore singing about it on television every Sunday night. The Ambassador had local radio spots during farm reports. The sales manager was 43, started selling Nash automobiles when he was 19. He'd memorized every specification, every advantage, every reason why AMC made more sense than Detroit. Didn't matter. He watched a young couple approach, the woman pregnant, the man wearing a UAW pin from the Chrysler plant. They looked at the Ambassador for exactly 12 seconds before moving on. 12 seconds to judge 24 months of engineering. The sales manager wanted to grab them, explain about the superior rust protection, the longer warranty, the Wisconsin craftsmanship. Instead, he straightened his tie and practiced his smile for the next 12-second judgment. His son was at Notre Dame studying business, planning to work for IBM when he graduated. Smart kid. Understood that computers were the future, not cars. Especially not cars from companies that measured success by how slowly they were failing. The sales manager had tried to interest him in the family business, 3 generations of automotive retail. The boy had laughed. Not cruel, just honest. "Dad, AMC will be gone before I'm 30. The kid was right. AMC would disappear into Chrysler when he was 29. That night in Detroit, after the show closed, the sales manager sat in the hotel bar with engineers and designers from Kenosha. They drank bourbon and told lies about next year being different. The Ambassador would get a V8 that would make Chevrolet weep. They'd hire an advertising agency from New York. They'd sponsor a racing team. They'd do something, anything, to make America notice that Wisconsin knew how to build automobiles too. 2 stools down, an engineer from Ford was drinking alone. The sales manager recognized him from previous shows. They nodded. That professional acknowledgement between men who sold their lives to different armies in the same war. After his 3rd bourbon, the Ford man walked over. "You guys make good cars," he said. Not mocking, genuine. "That Ambassador is better built than anything we're putting out." He paused, swirled his drink. "Doesn't matter, does it?" The sales manager wanted to argue, to fight, to defend 24 years of believing in the underdog. Instead, he raised his glass. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They drank to that truth in silence. September 1965. Kenosha Assembly Plant. The floor supervisor from Green Bay watched the Ambassador bodies moving down the line at 23 feet per minute. In Detroit, the Chevrolet line ran at 38 feet per minute. Those 15 feet made all the difference. 15 feet per minute times 60 minutes times 8 hours times 250 workdays. The math was ruthless. Detroit could build 2 cars for every one AMC produced. Maybe 3, if you counted overtime. The supervisor had started as a spot welder in 1946, fresh from the Pacific where he'd spent 13 months island hopping with the Marines, Saipan, Tinian, Iwo Jima. He'd figured after that building cars would feel like vacation. He was wrong. Different kind of warfare, but warfare nonetheless. Instead of Japanese pillboxes, it was Detroit boardrooms. Instead of mortars, it was market share. Instead of dying fast from shrapnel, you died slow from watching your life's work mean less each year. His team was good. Maybe the best assembly line workers in America, definitely the best paid outside Detroit. They had to be. When you're building one car for every two your competition produces, that one better be perfect. No Friday cars, no Monday morning hangovers hammered into sheet metal. Every Ambassador that rolled off the line carried the weight of keeping 2,000 families fed in a town that had nothing else if the plant closed. The supervisor spotted a problem before it happened. 23 years on the line gave you that ability. A kid, maybe 22, struggling with a door alignment. In Detroit, he'd flag it for quality control, let someone else fix it downstream. Here, the supervisor stepped in, showed the kid how to use his hip to hold the door while his hands guided the bolts. "Every car perfect," he said. "That's the only advantage we got." The kid nodded, went back to work. He'd last 8 months before Ford offered him 20% more to move to Dearborn. They all left eventually, the good ones. AMC trained them. Detroit stole them. Like everything else, the big guys could afford what the small guys developed. At lunch, the supervisor sat outside, despite the September heat, watching trucks loaded with finished Ambassadors heading for dealers who'd rather be selling Impalas. Each truck carried 6 cars. In the time it took to build those 6, Chevrolet had built 15, Ford 12. Even Chrysler, struggling themselves, managed 9. The math never changed, never got better, only worse, as Detroit modernized faster than Kenosha could afford to follow. He thought about Iwo Jima sometimes, not the combat, oddly, the waiting. Sitting in a landing craft, knowing the beach was mined, knowing the Japanese had pre-sighted every square foot of sand, knowing you were going anyway because that's what you did. Building Ambassadors felt the same. You knew Detroit had every advantage. You knew the dealers preferred the big 3. You knew the customers would buy on reputation and advertising rather than quality. You went to work anyway because that's what you did. His boy had just started high school, talked about college, maybe engineering. The supervisor encouraged it but hoped the kid would study something else. Anything else. Electronics. Aerospace. Hell, even agriculture had a better future than automotive if your automotive came from Wisconsin instead of Michigan. The age of independent car companies was ending. Had been ending since the moment General Motors decided market share mattered more than craftsmanship. That afternoon, a train passed the plant pulling auto carriers loaded with new Mustangs heading to Chicago. The supervisor counted 96 Fords passing while his team built 3 Ambassadors. The kid with the door problem watched too, probably calculating how much more he'd make installing those Mustang doors. The supervisor didn't blame him. Marines don't win by staying loyal to losing positions. They win by recognizing when to advance to better ground. 5:15 whistle, shift change. The supervisor watched his team head for the parking lot, half-driving Ramblers. Because employee discount half-driving used Chevrolets because, even with the discount, image mattered. He stayed behind, walking the empty line, running his hand along the half-built Ambassadors, waiting for tomorrow's shift. Good cars, probably great cars, built by people who gave a damn in a plant that couldn't afford not to, didn't matter. November 1967, Los Angeles Auto Show. The West Coast sales director from Madison stood in a $10,000 suit he'd bought for $800, watching real money flow around the AMC display like Moses had parted the Red Sea of cash. The new Ambassador had everything, 343 cubic inch V8. Power everything. Interior that looked like it belonged in a Cadillac. They'd even hired a real advertising agency, spent money they didn't have on television spots during Bonanza. Nobody cared. The Californians wandered past, glancing at the Ambassador like you'd look at a competent painting in a museum full of Rembrandts. Polite, brief, forgettable. Meanwhile, the new Camaro display looked like Times Square on New Year's Eve. Kids, adults, grandmothers, everyone wanted to touch the Chevrolet. The sales director had overheard one teenager call the Ambassador the car your math teacher would drive. The kid wasn't wrong. California was supposed to be different. New market, less loyalty to Detroit, more appreciation for innovation. The Ambassador got better gas mileage than anything in its class. The air conditioning actually worked in desert heat. The suspension was tuned for long highway drives, not just straight-line speed. Californians should have loved it. Instead, they loved Mustangs and Firebirds, and anything else that looked fast standing still. The sales director had been sent west specifically to crack this market. 38 years old, youngest executive at AMC, pulled from the Midwest because he understood marketing, not just metal. He'd spent 6 months studying California, buying patterns, hired local salespeople, even pushed for a convertible version that got killed when accounting showed the tooling costs. He'd done everything right. The Ambassador was still invisible. A dealer from San Diego stopped by, old friend from industry conventions. "How's it going?" Diplomatic question. They both knew how it was going. "We're building awareness." Industry speak for failing slowly. The dealer nodded. "I've got room for 2 on my lot, maybe 3 if you make the term sweet enough." 2 Ambassadors versus 40 Chevrolets. That was the ratio. That was always the ratio. In Wisconsin, it was 1 to 10. In Michigan, 1 to 20. In California, 1 to infinity, because infinity was how many Mustangs Ford could sell to kids who thought freedom came with a V8 and racing stripes. That night, the sales director called his wife in Madison. She asked how the show went. He lied. Said it went great. Lots of interest. California was finally warming to AMC. She knew he was lying. 20 years of marriage taught you the sound of defeat, dressed as optimism. But she played along, talked about their daughter's piano recital, their son's baseball game, normal life continuing while her husband tried to sell Wisconsin iron to California gold. After the call, he stood on the hotel balcony looking at the Los Angeles lights. Somewhere in that galaxy of electricity were 3 million people who'd never buy an Ambassador. Not because it was bad, because it wasn't from Detroit. Because it didn't have the marketing budget. Because their neighbor wouldn't be impressed. Because 100 reasons that had nothing to do with quality and everything to do with perception. He'd fought in Korea, artillery unit, forward observer. Spent 14 months calling in coordinates for guns he never saw to hit targets that disappeared in smoke. Selling Ambassadors felt the same, calling in features and benefits to customers he'd never meet, hoping something hit, watching everything disappear in the smoke of Detroit's advertising budget. The math was simple. AMC spent $2 million on marketing in 1967. Chevrolet spent that much on the Camaro launch party. January 1970, AMC headquarters, Detroit. They'd moved from Kenosha, trying to be closer to the action. Like moving next door to the pretty girl would make her notice you. The chief financial officer from Akron sat across from Dick Teague, AMC's chief designer, both staring at the same numbers. The Ambassador was losing $900 per unit, not on some, on all. Every Ambassador that rolled off the line rolled $900 directly out of AMC's bank account. "Kill it," the CFO said. "We can't," Teague replied. "It's our flagship. It's our anchor." They'd had this argument before, would have it again. The Ambassador was supposed to prove AMC could compete with anybody. Instead, it proved they couldn't. Too expensive to build properly, too cheap to build profitably, caught in that deadly middle where you lost money on volume. Teague had designed the latest Ambassador himself, stealing ideas from Italy, Germany, anywhere but Detroit. The car was beautiful. Magazine reviews called it stunning and sophisticated, and other adjectives that didn't translate to sales. 17,000 units in 1969. Chevrolet sold that many Impalas in 2 weeks. "We could make it cheaper," Teague suggested without conviction. "Cheaper than what?" "We're already using Rambler platforms, Rambler engines, everything but Rambler badges. How much cheaper can it get?" The answer was not cheap enough. The big three had economies of scale that turned expensive into affordable. When you're buying steel by the millions of tons, you get discounts. When you're buying by the thousands, you pay retail. Every bolt, every wire, every piece of glass cost AMC more than it cost Detroit. The Ambassador suffered most because it needed the most. The CFO had run the numbers every way possible. Build them in Mexico. Source: parts from Japan. Hell, he'd even calculated having dealers assemble them from kits. Nothing worked. The Ambassador was a luxury car from a company that couldn't afford lunch. His kid was at MIT studying economics. Home for Christmas, he'd asked his father why AMC kept building cars nobody wanted. The CFO had given him the company line about tradition and innovation and market position. The kid had laughed. "Dad, you're like a guy trying to date a supermodel with a bus pass and a coupon for Denny's." Smart kid, right kid. Teague left to sketch new designs, probably for cars AMC couldn't afford to build. The CFO stayed, staring at the numbers, trying to find hope in columns of red ink. Outside, it was snowing in Detroit, covering the Ambassador prototypes in the parking lot with white sheets like corpses waiting for spring burial. He'd grown up in Akron when it was the rubber capital of the world. Watched Firestone and Goodyear and B.F. Goodrich turn rubber into gold, then watched them move production overseas, leaving behind empty factories and full bars. Detroit was next. Maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, but eventually. The only question was whether AMC would die before or after the city that ignored it. The phone rang. Dealer in Minneapolis. Nobody wanted the Ambassadors he'd ordered. Could he return them for gremlins? The CFO said yes. What else could he say? We're losing 900 per unit, but please keep them anyway? He made a note to reduce Ambassador production by another 15%, then crossed it out and wrote 25%. That night, driving home in his Ambassador, company car, had to show faith. The heater failed. 22 degrees outside, 8 miles to his house, no heat. He laughed. Actually laughed out loud alone in a frozen car that represented everything wrong with American Motors Corporation: great engine, beautiful design, leather seats, no heat because some accountant, probably him, had approved a supplier who bid 3 cents less per heater core. July 1971, Kenosha. The last real push. They'd redesigned the Ambassador again, made it bigger, because bigger was always better in America, except when it wasn't, which was now, with gas lines starting and Japanese imports appearing like termites in the foundation. The assembly line worker from Sheboygan installed his 10,000th door. He'd counted. 10,000 doors on cars that fewer and fewer people wanted. The new Ambassador was actually brilliant. Best car AMC ever made. Motor Trend loved it. Car and Driver called it surprisingly excellent. Dealers called it unsellable. The worker didn't care about reviews. He cared about overtime, which had disappeared, and layoff rumors, which hadn't. His grandfather had helped build the factory in 1902. His father had built Nash Ambassadors when they meant something. Now he was building AMC Ambassadors that would sit on dealer lots until the paint faded and the tires developed flat spots. 3 generations of industrial pride ending in industrial decay. At break, the young guys talked about applications at Ford and GM. The old guys talked about retirement that might not come before the plant closed. The worker sat between them, 44 years old, too young to retire, too old to start over, perfect age to be forgotten when the factory became condos or a shopping mall or just rubble. "You think they'll kill the Ambassador?" someone asked. "Already dead," another answered. "Just hasn't stopped moving yet." Like a chicken with its head cut off, the worker thought. Running around the yard, spraying blood, not knowing it's already dinner. June 1973, oil embargo still 6 months away, but already you could feel it coming like animals sense earthquakes. The marketing manager from Duluth sat in a product meeting where they discussed making the Ambassador smaller again. Smaller but better. Better but cheaper. Cheaper but prestigious. The impossibility of it would have been funny if it wasn't paying his mortgage. AMC had a new plan. They'd turn the Ambassador into a luxury matador. Badge engineering, they called it. Like putting a Rolex face on a Timex and hoping nobody checked the movement. The marketing manager knew it wouldn't work. Everyone in the room knew it wouldn't work. They proceeded anyway because proceeding was what you did until someone had the courage to stop. We could position it as sensible luxury, someone suggested. Sensible luxury, like exciting accounting, thrilling insurance, passionate podiatry. The marketing manager had spent 3 weeks visiting dealers, hearing the same story with regional variations. Nobody walked in asking for an Ambassador. They settled for one when they couldn't afford a Buick. You can't build a brand on settlement. You can't create desire from resignation. His daughter had just graduated from college, art degree, living in San Francisco making jewelry and disappointment. She'd called last week, asked if he could help with rent. He'd sent a check, wondering if selling failed cars was better or worse than making failed art. At least she was failing at something she loved. He was succeeding at something he'd stopped believing in 10 years ago. The meeting droned on. Fabric choices, chrome options, whether to offer an 8-track player standard or optional. Details on a corpse. The Ambassador was already dead. They were just negotiating the funeral arrangements. October 1973. Gas lines stretched for blocks. The engineer from Milwaukee, the same one who'd watched his prototype burn in 1954, sat in his Ambassador waiting for fuel. 3 miles per gallon city, 8 highway if you were gentle. The Datsun in front of him probably got 25, the Honda behind him 30. His Ambassador had a V8 that could pull a boat up a mountain. Nobody needed to pull boats up mountains anymore. They needed to get to work on 5 gallons a week. He was 57 now, 32 years, with fear. AMC watching it die by degrees. The Ambassador had been his baby, his career, his proof that Wisconsin could engineer as well as anyone. Now it was a dinosaur drinking petroleum at extinction rates. The radio talked about the energy crisis like it was temporary. The engineer knew better. Americans had discovered efficiency, and efficiency didn't have Wisconsin accents or V8 engines or chrome bumpers that weighed more than entire Japanese cars. The Ambassador represented everything America was leaving behind: excess, waste, the belief that bigger meant better. His son had died in Vietnam in 1969, 23 years old, Marine Lieutenant, Bronze Star, and a body bag. The engineer had thrown himself into work after that, designing improvements for a car that didn't need to be improved, it needed to be euthanized. Work was easier than grief. Mathematics didn't ask why. Blueprints didn't care about meaning. Now, sitting in gas lines, he had time to think. Too much time. About the son who'd never design anything, about the cars that would never sell, about the career spent polishing brass on the Titanic. The line moved, 5 cars forward, another hour to the pump. The Ambassador's engine idled rough, needed a tune-up he'd do himself because he didn't trust anyone else with it. This car, this specific car, had been his personal vehicle for 3 years. He knew every sound, every vibration, every quirk. It was a good car, maybe even a great car, just born in the wrong decade to the wrong company in the wrong city. When he finally reached the pump, the station was limiting purchases to 10 gallons. 10 gallons would get him maybe 60 miles. He remembered when the Ambassador's fuel tank held 25 gallons, and nobody cared. Different world. World where America built what it wanted, and the rest of the planet bought it or walked. That world had ended while he was measuring pistons and calculating compression ratios. December 1974. The last Ambassador rolled off the line December 20th, a green 4-door with every option, built for nobody in particular, ordered by no dealer, destined for employee purchase or the crusher. The floor supervisor from Green Bay, still there, 28 years on the line, watched it pass his station. He didn't install anything on it. His job had been eliminated 6 weeks earlier. He was just there to watch, like attending your own funeral. The plant was quiet. Half the line was already gone, laid off or bought out, or just stopped showing up when they heard the Ambassador was finished. The ones still working moved like pallbearers, careful and sad, and ready for it to be over. That last car was perfect. Best Ambassador ever built. The doors aligned like Swiss watches. The paint looked deep enough to swim in. The engine purred like a satisfied cat. 20 years of learning, improving, perfecting, all concentrated in one car nobody wanted. The supervisor wanted to buy it himself, but unemployment doesn't finance. Nostalgia. Young kid from quality control asked him, "Why'd they keep making these so long?" How to explain? That the Ambassador was supposed to be AMC's dignity, their proof they belonged at the adult table, their chance to be more than the company that made Gremlins and Pacers. Pride, the supervisor said finally. Pure stupid pride. The kid nodded like he understood, but he didn't. Couldn't. He'd started 3 months ago, would be gone in 3 more when the plant closed completely. He'd never know what it felt like to build something you believed in, even when nobody else did. The supervisor stayed until the last Ambassador disappeared into the paint booth. Then he walked to his car, a 1968 Ambassador he'd bought new, maintained perfectly, would drive until it or he died. The parking lot was mostly empty. The ones that had been there since morning were covered with snow, looking like white tombstones in a cemetery of ambition. He drove home through Kenosha streets that would soon forget what 3 shifts changing sounded like. Past bars that would close when the unemployment ran out. Past houses that would sell for nothing when everyone left for cities that still made things. His wife had dinner ready, pot roast. She'd made pot roast every Thursday for 31 years. He didn't tell her about the last Ambassador, didn't tell her that their life was ending by schedule and statute. She knew, wives always knew, but they had this dinner to finish, this evening to complete, this pretense to maintain that tomorrow wouldn't be worse than today. After dinner, he sat in his garage looking at his Ambassador. 300,000 miles, original engine, still ran like it had something to prove. He'd rebuilt the transmission twice, the carburetor 4 times, replaced everything that could wear out and some things that shouldn't. The car would outlive the company that made it, outlive the factory, maybe outlive him. His boy called from Seattle. Boeing job, good money, real future. Asked how things were in Kenosha. The supervisor lied, said things were fine, said the plant was adapting, said American Motors had plans. The boy knew he was lying, but appreciated the effort. Some truths were too heavy for phone lines. That night, the supervisor couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the last Ambassador rolling off the line. Serial number ending in 2287. He'd memorized it without meaning to. The last of 521,000 Ambassadors built since 1927. Each one somebody's dream car, somebody's achievement, somebody's transportation to a better life. Now, just statistics in automotive history books nobody would read. January 1975, corporate headquarters. The executives held a wake disguised as a meeting. The Ambassador was dead. Long live the Matador. Except the Matador was dying too. Everything was dying. The company that had survived the Depression couldn't survive prosperity without scale. The chief designer from Los Angeles, Teague had moved west, following the future, presented plans for new models, small, efficient, Japanese-inspired. The board nodded and approved and pretended these cars would save them. Everyone knew better. AMC was a patient with terminal cancer discussing marathon training. Could we revive the Ambassador nameplate? Someone asked. On a smaller platform? The room went quiet, like suggesting resurrection at a funeral. Technically possible, realistically obscene. The Ambassador is done, the CEO said. Formerly president of Whirlpool, new appliances, not automobiles. Perfect for a company that had become more washing machine than car maker. We move forward. Forward meant backward. Smaller cars, smaller margins, smaller dreams. The Ambassador had been their moonshot. Now they were happy to orbit the Earth. The meeting ended with assignments nobody would complete and deadlines that would be missed by companies that no longer existed. The marketing director gathered his papers, knowing he'd be at Ford within 6 months. The chief engineer was already interviewing with Chrysler, rats, ship, swimming. March 1976. A dealer in Phoenix called the last remaining AMC sales office. He still had a 1974 Ambassador on his lot, brand new, 2 years old, 0 miles, couldn't give it away. The sales representative, 24, had never even seen an Ambassador in person, told the dealer to price it at cost. The dealer laughed. He'd been pricing it below cost for 18 months. "What should I do with it?" the dealer asked. "Whatever you want. It's your problem now." The dealer donated it to a local high school for their automotive program. Tax write-off was worth more than the car. The kids would tear it apart to learn how engines worked. The last Ambassador in Arizona would become an educational cadaver. Fitting end for a car that taught America what not to build. September 1980. Chrysler bought what was left of AMC for the Jeep brand. The Ambassador wasn't even mentioned in the acquisition documents, like it never existed. 5 decades of automotive history reduced to a footnote's footnote. The engineer from Milwaukee had retired to Florida. Sometimes he'd see an old Ambassador on the road, usually driven by someone who'd inherited it or bought it for nothing. He'd want to stop them, tell them about the engineering, the choices, the compromises that created that car. He never did. Let the dead rest. The floor supervisor from Green Bay went to work for Mercury Marine, building outboard motors. Better work. Boats didn't compete with Detroit. They competed with Japan, but at least on water, everyone started even. The sales manager from Racine opened an insurance agency, sold safety instead of steel. His son was right about IBM, made more in 5 years than his father made in 40 selling cars. Others scattered, some to Detroit, finally joining the enemy. Some to California, building aerospace instead of automobiles. Some just disappeared into different lives where they never had to explain why they'd spent careers building cars nobody wanted. June 1987, Kenosha. The AMC plant was being demolished. The mayor called it urban renewal. The former workers called it grave robbing. The building came down in sections, each piece carrying memories of metal and men and machines that tried to compete with giants. A reporter interviewed anyone who'd watched the demolition, asked about the Ambassador. Most didn't remember it. The ones who did spoke carefully, like describing a relative who'd died badly. "It was a good car," they'd say, then silence. Because what else was there? How do you explain decades of belief to someone born after it failed? The last wall fell on a Tuesday. Dust cloud visible for miles. When it cleared, there was nothing. Empty land where 2,000 people had once built dreams with 4 wheels and too much chrome. The city promised a shopping center, maybe condos, something useful, something that wouldn't break hearts by degrees. An old man watched from his car, 81 years old, had helped build the first Nash Ambassador in 1927, watched the last AMC Ambassador roll off the line in 1974. 47 years of Ambassadors. Now nothing but dust and development plans. He drove away in his 1962 Ambassador. 380,000 miles, still running, outlasted the company, outlasted the factory, would outlast him. The car rattled, needed shocks, but the engine was strong. Wisconsin strong. The kind of strong that didn't matter anymore in a world that measured value in stock prices instead of steel. December 24, 1995. Cleveland, a classic car show at the convention center. Among the Mustangs and Camaros and Corvettes, one 1973 AMC Ambassador. Last year of production. Perfect condition. The owner, a dentist who collected automotive oddities, had bought it from an estate sale. Old woman died, left behind a car her husband had purchased new and maintained religiously. People walked past the Ambassador to cluster around a Dodge Charger. Kids didn't know what AMC was. Adults vaguely remembered. My uncle had one of those, some said, always breaking down. Except they were thinking of gremlins or pacers. Nobody remembered the Ambassador. It had become invisible even in memory. The dentist didn't care. He liked orphans, cars that nobody saved because nobody loved them. His garage was full of Edsels and Corvairs and other automotive mistakes. The Ambassador was different, though. It wasn't a mistake. It was a tragedy. Competent car from an incompetent company. Good idea with bad timing. Right product for the wrong market. A judge walked by, made notes. The Ambassador wouldn't win anything. It never had. Participation trophy at best, like a kid who tried hard but came in last. The dentist would take it home, park it next to the others, preserve it like museums preserve mummies. Dead thing wrapped carefully to show future generations what failure looked like. October 2000. The internet was making everyone an expert on everything, including cars nobody remembered. An AMC Ambassador forum had 17 members worldwide. They shared repair tips, source parts from junkyards, posted photos of their cars like parents sharing baby pictures. A mechanic in Oregon had 3 Ambassadors, bought them cheap from people who didn't know what they were throwing away. He restored them at night after working on Toyotas and Hondas all day. The Ambassadors were therapy, simple engines, mechanical solutions, no computers, no complexity, just metal and fuel and faith. He'd never worked for AMC, born after it died. But something about the Ambassador spoke to him, the trying, the failing, the way it kept existing despite everything, like that friend who never quite succeeded but never quite quit. You rooted for them even though you knew the ending. His wife didn't understand. Why spend thousands restoring cars worth hundreds? Why preserve what the market had rejected? He couldn't explain. Some things deserved to survive because they'd tried so hard to live. The Ambassador had tried. God, how it had tried. September 11th, 2001. Everything changed. In Kenosha, an old man watched the towers fall on his television. 96 years old, had worked for Nash, for AMC, had built Ambassadors when they meant something. The terror on television felt distant. He'd lived through other endings, personal ones, industrial ones. His mind wandered, old man's prerogative, thought about the day Kennedy died. He'd been installing a transmission in a 1963 Ambassador. The line stopped. Everyone went home. The next day they came back, built cars like the president wasn't dead. What else could you do? Now planes were weapons and buildings were falling, and America was learning what vulnerability felt like. The Ambassador had been built for a confident America, an America that assumed tomorrow would be bigger, better, faster. That America had been dying since 1973 just took until now for everyone to notice. The old man died 2 weeks later, last of the original Ambassador builders. His obituary mentioned his service in World War I, his family, his church. Nothing about 40 years building cars, nothing about the Ambassador. Like it had been erased from history except in the memories of people too old to matter. March 2010, Barrett-Jackson Auction, Scottsdale. A 1970 AMC Ambassador crossed the block. Pristine condition, 28,000 original miles. The auctioneer tried to build excitement. Rare piece of American automotive history. The crowd was polite. Bidding started at $5,000, ended at $12,000. A 1970 Plymouth Barracuda sold 10 minutes later for $120,000. The Ambassador's new owner was a hedge fund manager who collected what he called misunderstood assets. Cars that should have succeeded, companies that should have survived, ideas that were right but early or late or just unlucky. The Ambassador fit perfectly. Right car, wrong company, wrong time, wrong country maybe. He'd never drive it. It would sit in a climate-controlled garage with 17 other cars he'd never drive. Investment, preservation, tax advantage. The Ambassador would exist without living, like a beautiful woman in a coma. Perfect, but pointless. July 4th, 2015. Kenosha held a parade. Former AMC workers were invited to ride in whatever they'd built. 3 ambassadors showed up, 3 out of 521,000. The drivers were all over 70. Their cars were older. The crowd was young, didn't understand what AMC was or why these old men were proud of failed cars. One driver had built ambassadors for 22 years, watched his friends get laid off, watched the factory close, watched the city pretend it never happened. But he still had his ambassador. 1971, 412,000 miles, 3rd engine, 4th transmission, original dream. Kids asked what it was. He explained about AMC, about trying to compete with Detroit, about building cars with your hands and heart when computers didn't exist. The kids nodded, took photos with their phones, forgot before they posted to Instagram. Vintage car show? What is AMC? Old people things. After the parade, the 3 ambassador owners sat in a bar that used to cash paychecks from the plant. They didn't talk about the cars, talked about grandkids, medications, who'd died since last year. The ambassadors sat outside baking in the July heat, antifreeze probably boiling, oil definitely leaking. Still running though, still running. Present day. You can buy a perfect AMC Ambassador for less than a used Honda Civic. Check online. Dozens for sale. Rare. Classic. Piece of history. All the words that mean nobody wants it, but somebody should. The Ambassador failed because it tried to be everything to everyone with resources for nothing. It was Wisconsin trying to be Detroit. It was David thinking he could become Goliath instead of staying David. It was American Motors believing that quality mattered more than quantity, that craftsmanship beat marketing, that being right was better than being rich. Every Ambassador built was a bet that Americans would choose substance over style. They didn't. Every Ambassador sold was proof that trying hard wasn't enough. You needed scale, scope, supply chains that stretched from Detroit to the moon. AMC had a factory in Kenosha and hope. Hope doesn't stamp steel. The last running ambassadors are tended by old men who remember when American cars were built by Americans for Americans. When you knew the guy who installed your engine, when your neighbor's job depended on you buying local. When loyalty meant something more than the best lease deal, those men are dying. The ambassadors are dying. The memory is dying. Soon it'll just be Wikipedia entries and restoration threads on forums nobody visits. The ambassador will become what it always was, a footnote in the story of how Detroit ate America and then got eaten by Japan and Germany and Korea and anyone else who figured out how to build better for less. But for 30 years, in a plant in Wisconsin, Americans built a car called the Ambassador. They built it with pride and precision and the peculiarly American belief that trying hard enough could overcome any disadvantage. They were wrong, but they tried. In the end, that's all anyone can do. Try to compete with giants. Try to matter in a market that doesn't care. Try to build something worth remembering, even if nobody remembers. The Ambassador couldn't compete with Detroit's Big Three because competition requires comparable resources. It's not about heart or quality or craftsmanship. It's about capital and scale and the ruthless mathematics of mass production. AMC had the heart. Detroit had everything else. In America, everything else always wins. Thanks for joining us on this journey through one of history's incredible survival stories. If you found it compelling, give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates these tales of courage. And don't forget to subscribe for more.